It was one of those unforgiving winter evenings where the cold seemed to creep into every crevice of the city, leaving the streets barren and lifeless. Claire, a retired schoolteacher in her early 70s, trudged along the icy sidewalk with bags of groceries weighing heavily in her hands. Her scarf was wrapped snugly around her neck, and her breath puffed out in clouds that quickly dissolved into the frigid air. She was preoccupied with thoughts of the warm tea she planned to brew at home, the soft glow of her reading lamp waiting for her. But as she turned the corner, her routine was shattered by the sight of a man lying motionless on the pavement, his body huddled against the freezing wind. Claire stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. The man looked to be in his 40s, his thin frame draped in a torn coat that barely seemed sufficient for the harsh weather. His hands, exposed to the elements, rested limply on the ground, their pallor a stark contrast to the dark concrete beneath him. For a moment, she hesitated, her instincts urging her to walk away. After all, the city was no stranger to such sights, and her children had warned her repeatedly to be cautious. "Mom, don't stop for strangers," her eldest son had said. "You don't know what they're capable of." But something about the man's stillness struck a chord deep within her. She looked around, hoping someone else would intervene, but the street was empty except for a few distant figures who walked on without so much as a glance. The familiar ache of frustration and sadness stirred in Claire's chest as she crouched beside the man, her knees protesting against the cold. "Excuse me, sir," she called softly, unsure if he could hear her. When he didn't respond, she reached out tentatively, her gloved hand brushing his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" she asked again, louder this time. The man stirred faintly, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyelids fluttered, revealing striking blue eyes that seemed to hold an unspoken story. Claire blinked, momentarily taken aback by a strange sense of familiarity, though she couldn't quite place it. His lips moved, but the words were lost to the wind, his voice too faint to hear. Her instincts kicked in. "You're freezing," she murmured, though he was too weak to respond. Glancing around once more, she saw that help was not forthcoming. The passers-by remained indifferent, their gazes fixed firmly ahead as if avoiding the scene unfolding before them. Anger and determination welled up in Claire as she resolved to act. She couldn't leave him there, not when every passing minute could mean the difference between life and death. She set her groceries down on the curb and slipped her arms under his shoulders, trying to lift him. He was heavier than she had expected, and her back protested immediately. She paused to catch her breath and adjusted her grip. "Come on," she urged, her voice firm. "You have to help me here." Slowly, with immense effort, she managed to prop him up into a sitting position. His head lolled against her shoulder, his body limp and unresponsive. The journey to her home, just a block away, felt like miles. The icy sidewalk was treacherous, every step a battle against her aging muscles and the freezing wind that bit at her face. The man's weight pressed heavily on her small frame, and she stumbled more than once, but she refused to give up. Claire's breath came in short, labored puffs as she passed houses with glowing windows, each one a silent reminder that help wasn't coming. When she finally reached her modest brick house, Claire fumbled with her keys, her fingers trembling from the cold and the strain. She wedged her shoulder against the door to push it open, the warm air from inside rushing out to greet them. "We're here," she whispered, more to herself than to the man, who groaned faintly in response. She maneuvered him inside and guided him to the couch in her living room, easing him down as gently as she could. Her cat, Ginger, appeared from the hallway, her green eyes wide with curiosity. She perched on the armrest of the chair, her tail flicking in disapproval. "Not now, Ginger," Claire muttered, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face as she straightened up. The man was slumped over, his breathing shallow but steady. Claire hurried to the kitchen, her mind racing as she filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. Grabbing a thick blanket from the hallway closet, she returned to the living room and draped it over the man. She noticed for the first time how gaunt he looked, his cheeks hollow, his beard speckled with frost, and his hands marked with the calluses of hard labor. "Who are you?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. When the tea was ready, Claire knelt beside the man and lifted his head slightly, pressing the warm cup to his lips. "Here, drink this," she urged gently. He sipped weakly, his hands trembling as they clutched the mug. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, they locked onto hers. In that fleeting instant, Claire felt a strange jolt of recognition, though she couldn't place where she'd seen those piercing blue eyes before. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. The simple words struck Claire in a way she hadn't expected. She tucked the blanket around him more securely and settled into the armchair opposite him, her thoughts a whirlwind. Who was he? What had brought him to this point? And why did he feel so hauntingly familiar? The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the heater and the occasional soft sigh from the man as he drifted into a restless sleep. Claire didn't know it yet, but this seemingly small act of kindness would unravel a series of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her past and the stranger who had now become a part of her life. The following morning, Claire woke to the pale light of dawn streaming through her lace curtains, the faint sound of birdsong cutting through the otherwise quiet house. She sat up in her bed, her joints creaking as they always did in the winter, and for a brief moment, she wondered if the events of the previous night had been some strange dream. But as she wrapped her robe around herself and shuffled into the living room, the sight of the man lying on her couch confirmed it hadn't been. He looked different in the soft morning light. The deep lines etched into his face spoke of a life filled with hardship, and his ragged appearance tugged at her heart. He stirred as she approached, his eyes blinking open slowly, as if he were trying to remember where he was. When his gaze finally met hers, there was a flicker of something, a question, maybe gratitude, or perhaps even recognition, that made Claire's breath catch for a moment. "You're awake," she said, her voice gentle as she perched on the edge of the armchair across from him. "How are you feeling?" The man sat up with some effort, wincing as he shifted under the blanket she'd tucked around him the night before. "Better," he croaked, his voice hoarse and gravelly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Better, thanks to you." Claire offered him a small smile and passed him a fresh cup of tea she'd prepared earlier. He accepted it with shaking hands, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. "You gave me quite a scare last night," she said, watching as he sipped the tea cautiously. "Do you remember what happened?" The man frowned, his brows knitting together as he stared into the steam rising from the mug. "I was walking," he said slowly, his voice hesitant, as though each word was a struggle to pull from his memory. "Then everything went black. I guess I must have passed out." Claire nodded, her curiosity growing by the second. "What's your name?" she asked softly, her tone careful not to push too hard. "James," he said after a long pause, his voice quiet. "Well, James," Claire said, leaning back in her chair, "I don't know what brought you to that street corner, but you're lucky I found you when I did." Another hour out there in the cold, she let the sentence trail off, not wanting to voice the obvious. James nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know," he murmured, his voice tinged with shame. Claire wanted to ask him more, where he was from, how he'd ended up in such dire circumstances, but something about his demeanor made her hold back. Instead, she stood and began tidying the room, giving him space to gather his thoughts. As she picked up the blanket he'd kicked to the floor, a faint memory flickered in her mind. It was nothing more than a sensation at first, a fleeting image of bright blue eyes and a voice calling her name, but was gone as quickly as it came. Shaking her head, Claire dismissed the thought and turned back to James. "You should eat something," she said, her tone brisk as she headed toward the kitchen. "You need to regain your strength." As she prepared a simple breakfast of toast and scrambled eggs, Claire couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she'd seen him before. It wasn't just his blue eyes, though they were striking and hard to forget. It was something deeper, a sense of familiarity that didn't make any sense. By the time she returned to the living room with a tray of food, the feeling had settled into the back of her mind like an unanswered question. James ate slowly, his movements deliberate as though he wasn't used to having a proper meal. Claire watched him carefully, noting the way his hands trembled slightly and how he avoided meeting her gaze for too long. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked after a while, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. He shook his head. "No," he said simply, his voice low. "Where are you from then?" James hesitated, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "It's been a long time," he said at last, his tone evasive. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she decided to change tactics. "You know," she said, leaning back in her chair, "you remind me of someone. Someone I knew a long time ago." James froze, his hand tightening around the fork. "Do I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Claire said, studying him closely. "There was a boy, years ago, when I was just a child. He saved me from drowning in a lake near my family's old home. I never got his name, but he had the same blue eyes as you." For a moment, James said nothing. Then, slowly, he set the fork down and looked up at her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. "That's quite a story," he said finally, his voice measured. Claire nodded, a wistful smile playing at her lips. "It was a long time ago," she said, her gaze distant as the memory came back to her in fragments. The feeling of water pulling her under, the sound of her own panic screams, and then the boy's hand reaching out to pull her to safety. "I never got to thank him," she added softly. "I always wondered what became of him." James looked down at his hands, his jaw tightening. "Maybe he's closer than you think," he said, his tone so quiet that Claire almost didn't hear him. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow still. She opened her mouth to ask him what he meant, but before she could speak, James stood abruptly, swaying slightly as he gripped the back of the couch for support. "Thank you for the food," he said, his voice strained. "I should go." "No, you can't leave," Claire said, rising to her feet. "You're not well enough yet." James hesitated, his shoulders tense as though he were weighing his options. Finally, he sank back onto the couch with a sigh, his head in his hands. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I shouldn't be here. It's complicated." "Then explain it to me," Claire said firmly, her hands on her hips. "Because right now, I don't understand anything. Why were you out there in the cold? Why does it feel like I know you?" James didn't answer, and the silence stretched between them, heavy and unresolved. Claire sat back down, her mind racing with possibilities. She didn't know it yet, but the truth was closer than she could have imagined, and it would change everything she thought she knew about her past. For the next few days, James stayed in Claire's home, recovering his strength little by little. She insisted he take it easy, setting up the spare bedroom for him despite his initial protests. He seemed reluctant to accept her help, but Claire dismissed his hesitations with a wave of her hand and a no-nonsense attitude that left no room for argument. "You don't have to tell me everything now," she told him firmly. "But until you're steady on your feet, you're staying put." James kept mostly to himself, retreating to the room Claire had prepared for him, only venturing out for meals or the occasional walk to stretch his legs. He was quiet and guarded, answering her questions with as few words as possible. Yet, despite his reserved demeanor, Claire couldn't help but feel drawn to him. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken pain, perhaps, or a deep-seated burden, that stirred a compassion in her she hadn't felt in years. On the third evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Claire decided she'd had enough of the silence. She brought 2 mugs of tea into the living room, where James was sitting in her late husband's favorite chair, staring out the window. "I thought you might like something warm," she said, handing him one of the mugs. "Thank you," he said quietly, his hands wrapping around the mug as though savoring its warmth. Claire sat across from him, her own tea untouched. "I've been patient," she began, her tone measured. "But I think it's time you told me the truth, James. Who are you? And why does it feel like we've met before?" James stiffened, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow outside. For a long moment he said nothing, and Claire began to think he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping as though a great weight had settled upon them. "It's not an easy story to tell," he admitted, his voice low. "I'm not going anywhere," Claire said firmly, leaning forward. James hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. "Do you remember the lake you told me about?" he asked finally. Claire's breath caught. "Of course," she said softly. "It's one of those memories that stays with you, no matter how much time passes." James nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "I was there that day," he said. "I was the boy who pulled you out." The room seemed to grow impossibly still, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Claire stared at him, her mind racing to make sense of his words. "You're the boy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded again, a faint bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I didn't think you'd remember me," he said. "I mean, it's been, 50 years?" Claire's heart raced as the fragments of her childhood memory began to fall into place. The blue eyes, the voice calling her name, the strong arms pulling her to safety, they all matched the man sitting before her. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me," James admitted. "And honestly, I wasn't sure if I should tell you at all. I didn't want to complicate things." Claire shook her head, her emotions a whirlwind of disbelief, gratitude, and something she couldn't quite name. "Complicate things? James, you saved my life. If it weren't for you," her voice trailed off as the enormity of it all sank in. "It wasn't a big deal," James said, his tone dismissive. "Any decent person would have done the same." "But you did it," Claire said, her voice firm. "You were just a boy, and you risked your life to save a stranger. That's not something I'll ever forget." James looked down at his hands, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't the only reason I was there that day," he said quietly. Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, his jaw tightening. "My father worked on your family's estate," he said finally. "He was one of the groundskeepers. We lived in a small cottage at the edge of the property." Claire's eyes widened. "I remember the groundskeeper," she said. "Mr. Parker. He was always so kind to me and my siblings." "Are you saying you're his son?" James nodded, his expression clouded. "Yes, but things weren't as simple as they seemed back then." Claire leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" James took a deep breath, as though preparing himself for something difficult. "My father, he wasn't treated well by your family," he said carefully. "He worked hard, but he was never shown the respect he deserved. And when I saved you that day, he was furious. He thought it would bring attention to us in a way we didn't need. He always said, 'Keep your head down and stay out of trouble.'" Claire felt a pang of guilt at his words. She had been just a child at the time, oblivious to the struggles of the people who worked for her family. "I had no idea," she said softly. "I didn't expect you to," James said. "You were just a kid. But that day changed everything for me. My father was so angry that we ended up leaving the estate not long after. I never saw it again, or you." Claire's heart ached as she listened to his story. "And what happened after that?" she asked gently. James shrugged, his expression distant. "Life wasn't kind," he said simply. "My father passed away a few years later, and I had to fend for myself. I've been on my own ever since." Claire felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to say something, anything, but no words seemed adequate. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. James looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "None of it was your fault. But I guess when I saw you again on that street, I felt like maybe it was fate. Like maybe I was meant to save you again." Claire's breath hitched at his words. "You have," she said, her voice trembling. "In more ways than you know." For the first time, James smiled, a small, hesitant smile that seemed to lighten the weight in the room. But even as the moment passed, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, more that he wasn't telling her. And she was determined to find out. The revelation of James's identity weighed heavily on Claire's mind in the days that followed. She couldn't stop replaying their conversations, each new detail deepening her sense of both gratitude and unease. Knowing that James had been such an integral part of her past and had endured so much hardship afterward, left her feeling an obligation she couldn't ignore. Yet, the reality of his current situation complicated everything. She was an old woman living on a modest pension in a house that barely fit her needs. How much could she realistically do to help him? James, for his part, seemed torn between accepting her kindness and retreating back into the shadows of his own solitude. He insisted he didn't want to burden her, yet he stayed, unable or perhaps unwilling to leave. Claire noticed his discomfort and understood it. After all, he was a proud man who had survived so much on his own. But there were moments when his guard slipped, moments when he seemed almost grateful to be seen, to be cared for. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls, Claire decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. "James," she began, her voice steady but gentle, "what are your plans? Where will you go once you're ready to leave?" James stared into the flames, the light dancing in his blue eyes. "I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "I've been moving from place to place for so long, I don't really have anywhere to go. But I can't stay here forever." "Why not?" Claire asked, surprising even herself with the question. James turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. "Because this is your home, Claire. You've already done more for me than anyone has in years. I can't impose on you like this." "You're not imposing," Claire said firmly. "If anything, you're helping me. This house has felt so empty since my husband passed. Having someone to talk to share meals with, it's been nice." James looked away, his jaw tightening. "You deserve better than this," he said quietly. "So do you," Claire countered, her tone sharp but kind. "And I'm not about to let you walk out that door without a plan." James sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," he said, "but you don't know what you're getting yourself into." "I've made mistakes, Claire. Big ones. If people knew I was here, it could cause trouble for you." Claire's heart skipped a beat at his words. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, her voice low. James hesitated, his eyes searching hers as though deciding how much to reveal. "Let's just say my past isn't exactly spotless," he said finally. "There are people who might come looking for me. People who wouldn't hesitate to drag you into it if they thought it would get to me." The implications of his words sent a chill down Claire's spine. She had spent her entire life avoiding conflict, raising her children in a safe, stable environment, and keeping to herself after her husband's death. The idea of inviting danger into her home went against every instinct she had. And yet, the thought of sending James back into the cold, unforgiving world felt equally wrong. "James," she said after a long silence, "everyone has a past. Some of us are just better at hiding it than others. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve a chance to move forward." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You don't understand," he said. "I'm not the same person I was back then. The boy who saved you, he's long gone. "I don't believe that," Claire said softly. "You're still the same person at your core, James. You just need someone to remind you of that." Her words seemed to strike a chord, and for a moment, James looked as though he might argue. But then he sighed, the fight draining out of him. "You're too kind, Claire," he said. "I don't deserve it." "Let me be the judge of that," she replied with a small smile. That night, after James had gone to bed, Claire sat in the kitchen, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on the table. She had been careful with her finances since retiring, but adding another person to her household, even temporarily, was stretching her budget thin. She thought of her children, who would no doubt disapprove of her decision to take in a stranger, no matter who he was or what he had done for her in the past. She could already hear her eldest son's voice in her head. "Mom, you can't save everyone. You need to think about yourself for once." But how could she think of herself when James had so clearly been abandoned by everyone else? She thought of the years he had spent wandering, the losses he had endured, and the sacrifices he had made, even as a child. She thought of his words about his father, about the injustice of a life spent working hard only to be dismissed and forgotten. And she thought of the day by the lake, the boy who had risked everything to save her without hesitation. By the time she went to bed, Claire had made up her mind. She would help James, no matter the cost. The next morning, she called her eldest son, David, knowing full well it would lead to an argument. "Mom, this is insane," he said after she explained the situation. "You don't even know this man. What if he's dangerous? What if he's lying to you?" "He's not lying," Claire said firmly. "And he's not dangerous. He's just lost, and I can't turn my back on him." David sighed, exasperated. "You're too trusting, Mom. You always have been. But this isn't like helping out a neighbor or donating to charity. This is a man with a past you know nothing about. You need to think about what this could mean for you." "I'm thinking about it," Claire said. "And I'm also thinking about what it would mean if I didn't help him. I couldn't live with myself." Their conversation ended in a stalemate, leaving Claire feeling both resolute and unsettled. She knew she was taking a risk, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a chance to repay a debt she hadn't realized she owed. As the days passed, Claire and James settled into an uneasy routine. He began helping around the house, fixing things that had been broken for years and chopping firewood for the old stove in the kitchen. Slowly, he began to open up, sharing fragments of his life that gave Claire a glimpse into the man he had become. But even as they grew closer, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, secrets he wasn't ready to share. And she couldn't ignore the whispers of doubt in her own mind, the fear that she might be putting herself in danger. The moral dilemma weighed heavily on her, pulling her in two directions. On one hand, she wanted to protect herself and her family, to avoid the complications that came with helping a man like James. But on the other, she couldn't deny the deep sense of responsibility she felt toward him, a man who had once saved her life and now seemed to need saving himself. The weeks passed, and winter's icy grip began to loosen. Snow that had once blanketed the streets in silence now melted into streams trickling down the gutters. Claire and James had settled into an unspoken rhythm, their days filled with quiet moments of companionship that neither had realized they needed. James, though still guarded, had become an essential presence in the house. He chopped wood, repaired creaky doors, and even fixed the grandfather clock in the corner of the living room, a task Claire had long since deemed hopeless. Yet, despite their growing bond, Claire couldn't shake the sense that James was holding something back. There were moments when she would catch him staring into the distance, his jaw tight and his eyes clouded with something heavy. She knew better than to press him, but the weight of his silence hung between them, a shadow over their fragile connection. One afternoon, as the pale winter sun filtered through the lace curtains, Claire found James in the living room, seated in her late husband's chair with an old photograph in his hands. Her breath caught as she recognized the image, a snapshot of her family taken decades ago, when she was just a young girl. She stepped closer, her slippers silent on the hardwood floor. "Where did you find that?" she asked gently. James didn't look up. His fingers traced the edges of the photograph, his expression unreadable. "It was in the drawer by the clock," he said quietly. "I was looking for a screwdriver, and I found this instead." Claire's heart ached at the sight of the picture. It was a rare moment of joy captured on film. Her father standing tall and proud, her mother with a soft smile, and herself and her siblings huddled together by the lake. She hadn't looked at it in years. "That was taken the summer before everything changed," she said softly, sinking into the chair across from him. James finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and there was something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. "I remember this day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire blinked, startled. "You do?" He nodded, his grip on the photograph tightening. "I was there, watching from the trees. My father didn't want me to get too close to your family, but I always liked to explore near the lake. I saw you laughing, running with your siblings." And then he trailed off, his voice faltering. "And then I fell into the water," Claire finished, the memory flooding back with startling clarity. "I remember the panic, the cold. I couldn't swim, and the current was pulling me under. I thought I was going to die." James's jaw tightened. "I heard you screaming," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't think. I just ran. By the time I got to you, you were barely above the surface. I grabbed you and pulled you out." Claire's eyes filled with tears as the long-buried memory surfaced in vivid detail. "You saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "You risked everything, even though your father didn't want you near us." James looked away, his expression shadowed. "I couldn't just stand there and do nothing," he said. "But it cost us everything. My father was furious when he found out. He said we didn't belong there, that we couldn't afford to make waves." Claire's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know. I was just a child, oblivious to everything outside my little world." "It wasn't your fault," James said, his tone firm. "You were a kid. You didn't know the kind of life we lived, the kind of life people like us were forced to live." The words hit Claire like a punch to the gut. She had always known her family had privilege, but hearing it laid bare like this, from someone who had been so directly affected by it, was a painful reminder of the divide that had once existed between them. "If I could go back and change things, I would," she said, her voice thick with emotion. James gave her a small, sad smile. "You already have," he said. "By helping me now, you've given me something I haven't had in years, a chance to feel human again." For a moment, they sat in silence, the photograph resting between them like a bridge spanning the years that had separated their lives. But then James's expression darkened, and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, his voice low. Claire's stomach tightened. "What is it?" James hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. "When my father took us away from the estate, he told me something I didn't understand at the time," he said. "He said your family owed us more than they'd ever admit. I didn't know what he meant, but over the years, I started to piece things together." Claire frowned, confusion and unease swirling in her chest. "Owed you? Owed you what?" James took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "Your father, he wasn't just my father's employer. He made promises to him, promises about our future, about opportunities we'd never had before. But when the time came, he broke those promises. He left us with nothing." The words hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on Claire's chest. She wanted to defend her father, to say it couldn't be true, but the look in James's eyes silenced her protests. "I didn't know," she said finally, her voice small. "I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," James said, his tone softening. "But it doesn't change what happened. My father spent his life working for yours, believing things would get better. And when it didn't, it broke him. It broke us." Claire's hands trembled as she reached for the photograph, her fingers brushing against its worn edges. "James, I don't know how to make this right," she said, her voice trembling. "But I want to try. Please, let me try." James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, a flicker of hope breaking through the shadows in his eyes. "You've already started," he said quietly. "It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. But it was a beginning. And for Claire, that was enough." The revelation hung between them like a fragile thread, something neither of them was quite sure how to navigate. James's words had opened a door Claire had never thought to step through, a portal to a past she'd spent years idealizing. Her childhood, once remembered as idyllic, now felt stained by the knowledge of broken promises and silent struggles endured by people like James and his father. Yet, as unsettling as the truth was, it deepened her resolve to make things right. Claire decided to act. That same week, she called the local community center to inquire about programs that could help James get back on his feet. It wasn't an easy conversation, explaining his situation without betraying his trust, but she managed to arrange a meeting with a social worker who specialized in assisting individuals facing homelessness. "This could be a fresh start for you," Claire told James over breakfast one morning, her tone hopeful. James didn't share her optimism. He stirred his coffee absently, his jaw tightening. "I've been through this before," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "The systems they put in place, they're not designed to help people like me. They just shuffle you from one place to another until you're forgotten." Claire reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You won't be forgotten," she said firmly. "Not this time. I'll make sure of it." James looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Why are you doing all this for me?" he asked quietly. "You don't owe me anything, Claire. If anything, it's the other way around." Claire smiled softly, her eyes misting over. "Because you remind me of what's important," she said. "It's easy to go through life thinking you're doing enough, being kind enough. But then someone like you comes along and reminds me there's always more to give." James didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips before he looked away. The following week was a whirlwind of activity. Claire drove James to the community center for his appointment, standing by his side as he reluctantly filled out paperwork. She helped him gather the documents they needed to apply for a temporary ID, and even accompanied him to the thrift store to pick out clothes that would help him make a good impression at potential job interviews. "You clean up nicely," she teased as he emerged from the dressing room in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks. "You're relentless, you know that?" James said, shaking his head. "And don't you forget it," Claire replied with a grin. But as Claire poured herself into helping James rebuild his life, she began to face resistance from those closest to her. Her eldest son, David, visited one afternoon and was less than pleased to find James fixing a broken railing on the back porch. "Mom, this has gone too far," David said, pulling her aside. "You barely know this man, and now you're letting him live here? What if something happens to you?" "Nothing is going to happen to me," Claire said, her tone firm. "You don't know that," David argued. "What if he has a criminal record? What if he's dangerous?" Claire's patience, worn thin by the weeks of stress and sleepless nights, finally snapped. "David, do you hear yourself?" she said, her voice rising. "You're talking about him like he's not even a person. He's a human being who's had a harder life than you could imagine. And if I can do something to help him, I will." David threw up his hands in exasperation. "You're too trusting, Mom. You always have been. But this isn't the same world you grew up in." People take advantage of kindness. Maybe, Claire said, her tone softening. But that doesn't mean I should stop being kind. What kind of world would that be? David stared at her for a long moment, his frustration warring with a begrudging respect. I just don't want to see you get hurt, he said finally, his voice quiet. I know, Claire said, her heart aching at the concern etched into his face. But sometimes, taking a risk is the only way to make a difference. Despite the tension with her family, Claire remained steadfast. She and James began attending weekly community meetings, where he reluctantly opened up to others about his experiences. It wasn't easy. James often retreated into silence, his discomfort palpable, but Claire was there every step of the way, offering quiet encouragement and unwavering support. One evening, as they walked home from a particularly emotional meeting, James broke the silence. I don't know how you do it, he said, his voice low. Do what? Claire asked, glancing at him. Believe in people, he said, shoving his hands into his pockets. After everything you've heard, everything you've seen, how do you still believe? Claire smiled, her breath visible in the crisp night air. Because I've lived long enough to know that people are complicated, she said. We all have our flaws, our mistakes, our regrets. But I've also seen how much good we're capable of when we stop focusing on what divides us and start focusing on what connects us. James didn't respond, but his expression softened, and for the first time, Claire felt like her words might actually be reaching him. But just as things seemed to be improving, the shadows of James's past reemerged. One afternoon, as Claire returned home from the grocery store, she found James sitting on the porch, his face pale and his hands trembling. What's wrong? She asked, setting the bags down and rushing to his side. I saw someone, he said, his voice shaky. Someone from before. Claire's heart sank. What do you mean? Who was it? James shook his head, his eyes filled with fear. I don't know his name, but he recognized me. I could see it in his face. And if he knows I'm here, you're safe, Claire said firmly, gripping his hands. No one is going to hurt you, James. Not while you're here. But as she held his gaze, she realized the depth of the danger they might be in. James's past wasn't just a distant memory. It was a living, breathing threat. And now it was at their doorstep. The encounter with the stranger haunted both Claire and James in the days that followed. The weight of his past, which James had so carefully concealed, now felt like a storm cloud hovering over them, ready to break at any moment. Claire tried to reassure him, but she could see the fear etched into his face, the tension in his shoulders as he sat by the window, watching the street for signs of danger. One evening, unable to bear the silence, Claire approached him in the living room where he sat nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. James, she began softly, sitting across from him, you need to tell me the truth. Who was that man you saw? What does he know about you? James sighed, setting the cup down on the coffee table with trembling hands. For a moment, he said nothing, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. Then, as if the dam had finally broken, the words began to spill out. Before I ended up on the streets, I worked for a man named Connolly, he said, his voice low and steady. He wasn't a good man. He ran things that most people would call illegal, but I didn't have many options back then. I did what I had to do to survive. Claire's heart sank as she listened, the details painting a picture of a life far harder than she had imagined. What kind of work? She asked cautiously. James hesitated, his jaw tightening. Everything from running messages to worse things. Things I'm not proud of, he admitted, his voice thick with shame. But when I realized how deep I'd gotten, it was too late to walk away. Connolly doesn't let people leave. Not without consequences. Claire's breath hitched. Is that why you've been running? Why you're afraid of being found? James nodded, his expression grim. I left everything behind years ago. But men like Connolly have long memories. That man I saw on the street, he was one of Connolly's enforcers. If he recognized me, it's only a matter of time before they come looking." Claire sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She thought of her quiet, predictable life before James had entered it, the safety and stability she had worked so hard to maintain. And yet, despite the risks, she couldn't bring herself to abandon him. "James," she said firmly, "you're not alone in this. We'll figure something out." James shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You don't understand, Claire. These people don't forgive. They don't forget. If they find out I'm here, they won't just come after me. They'll come after you too." The weight of his words settled heavily in the room, but Claire refused to let fear dictate her actions. "Then we'll make sure they don't find you," she said, her voice resolute. Over the next few days, Claire worked tirelessly to piece together a plan. She reached out to an old friend, a retired lawyer named Evelyn, who had a reputation for handling complicated cases. Evelyn agreed to meet with James, promising to look into his legal options and help him navigate a path forward. When the day of the meeting arrived, James was reluctant to go, but Claire's determination left him little choice. "You've spent your whole life running," she told him as they stood in the kitchen. "It's time to stop. Let someone help you for once." Evelyn was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a warm smile and a knack for putting people at ease. As James recounted his story, she listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You've been through a lot," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But the good news is the statute of limitations for most of what you've described is likely passed. As long as there are no outstanding warrants, you might be able to move forward without fear of legal repercussions." James looked skeptical. "And what about Connolly?" he asked. "He doesn't care about statutes or warrants. He cares about loyalty. And as far as he's concerned, I broke mine." Evelyn's smile faded, and she folded her hands on the table. "That's a harder problem to solve," she admitted. "But there are ways to protect yourself. We can look into getting you a new identity, a fresh start in a place where no one knows your name." James glanced at Claire, his eyes filled with doubt and a flicker of hope. "It sounds too good to be true," he said quietly. "It won't be easy," Evelyn said, "and it won't happen overnight. But it's possible. The question is, are you ready to take that step?" For a moment, James was silent, his gaze fixed on the table. Then he nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I am," he said. The meeting with Evelyn marked a turning point for James. For the first time in years, he began to see a future that didn't involve running or hiding. But as the days passed, Claire noticed a change in him, a restlessness, as though he were grappling with something he couldn't quite put into words. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, James finally broke the silence. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice hesitant. Claire looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He handed it to Claire, his hands trembling slightly. "This is my father," he said quietly. Claire took the photo, her breath catching as she studied the image. The man in the picture was older, with weathered features and piercing blue eyes that mirrored James's. But what struck her most was the familiar landscape in the background, a view of the lake near her childhood home. "My father told me something before he died," James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He said your father owed him more than a job. He said there was a debt, one that was never repaid." Claire's heart pounded as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "What kind of debt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James hesitated, his jaw tightening. He didn't say much, but "I think it had something to do with my mother. She died when I was a baby, and my father never talked about her." But there was always this sense that something wasn't right. Like there was more to the story. The revelation sent a chill down Claire's spine. She thought of her father, a man she had idolized as a child, but who had always seemed distant and complicated as she grew older. Could he have been hiding something? Something that had shaped James's entire life? "I don't know the whole truth," James said, his voice trembling. "But I think your family and mine are connected in ways neither of us ever realized." Claire stared at the photograph, her mind racing with questions. She didn't have the answers yet, but she was determined to find them, no matter what it took. The photograph remained on the coffee table for days, a silent witness to the growing unease in the house. Claire couldn't stop staring at it, her mind churning with questions about her father and the mysterious connection to James's family. The lake in the background, the same lake where James had saved her life as a child, now felt like more than a setting for a memory. It was a symbol of something deeper, a thread that had tied their lives together long before either of them realized it. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire dug into the few keepsakes she had left from her childhood, sifting through old photographs, letters, and records stored in a dusty box in the attic. The process was slow and painstaking, each item a relic of a time that now felt both distant and unfamiliar. But as she worked, pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. She found an old ledger bearing her father's handwriting, filled with meticulous notes about the estate's finances and employees. Among the names listed was James's father, Henry Parker. Next to his name, in faded ink, was a notation, "Debt cleared, July 1965. The word sent a shiver down Claire's spine. What debt? And why had it been so significant that her father felt the need to document it? Claire showed the ledger to James that evening, her hands trembling as she placed it on the table between them. "I found this in my father's things," she said. "It mentions your father, Henry. Something about a debt being cleared." James leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he read the words. "He never talked about this," he said quietly, "but he always carried a sense of resentment, like he'd been wronged and couldn't let it go." The revelation only deepened the mystery, but it also strengthened Claire's resolve. If there were answers to be found, she would find them. The next day, she visited the county archives, poring over old records and property deeds with the help of a patient clerk. It was there, buried in a stack of legal documents, that she discovered the truth. Decades earlier, Claire's father had borrowed a substantial sum of money from Henry Parker to save the estate from foreclosure. Unable to secure a loan through traditional means, he had turned to his trusted groundskeeper for help. Henry had agreed, but the terms of their arrangement were never made public. When the debt was finally repaid, it had been on terms that left Henry with little to show for his generosity. But that wasn't all. As Claire dug deeper, she uncovered a series of letters between her father and Henry that hinted at an even more personal connection, one that centered on James's mother. The letters were cryptic, filled with veiled references to shared responsibilities and promises made. One line in particular stood out: "What happened was a tragedy, but we must do what is right for the boy." Claire's hand shook as she pieced together the implication. Her father and James's mother had shared a history, perhaps even a romance that had led to James's birth. If true, it meant James wasn't just a stranger who would save her life. He was family. That evening, as the winter wind howled outside, Claire sat across from James in the dimly lit living room, the letters spread out between them. "I found something," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Something that changes everything." James picked up one of the letters, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Are you saying?" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Claire nodded, her throat tight. "I think my father and your mother had a relationship," she said. "And I think you might be my half-brother." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a blanket. James stared at the letters, his hands trembling. All this time, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was just some kid from the wrong side of the tracks. And now you're telling me I'm family, Claire finished, tears streaming down her cheeks. Your family, James. And I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. James leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of shock, anger, and something Claire couldn't quite place. Why didn't anyone tell me? He asked, his voice rising. Why did my father keep this from me? Why did your father keep it from you? Claire shook her head, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I don't know, she admitted. But I do know this, you don't have to run anymore. You have a place here with me. James's eyes met hers, and for a moment, it looked as though he might argue. But then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. I don't know what to do with this, he said honestly. I don't know how to feel. You don't have to figure it all out right now, Claire said gently. We'll take it one step at a time. Together. In the days that followed, Claire and James began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship, this time with the knowledge of their shared history. James opened up about his fears and regrets, while Claire shared stories of her father that painted him as both flawed and human. They laughed, they cried, and they found solace in the understanding that, despite everything, they had found each other. But the revelation also brought a sense of closure for James. With Evelyn's help, he took steps to secure a new identity and build a stable life. He began working part-time at a local hardware store, using the skills he'd honed over years of fixing things. Slowly, he began to carve out a place for himself in the world, no longer haunted by the shadows of his past. For Claire, the experience was transformative. She had spent years mourning the loss of her husband and clinging to the safety of her routines. But James had reminded her of the importance of taking risks, of opening her heart to the unexpected. In helping him, she had rediscovered a sense of purpose and gained a brother she never knew she had. On a crisp spring morning, as they sat together on the porch watching the world come alive again, James turned to Claire and said, "Thank you for everything. I don't know where I'd be if it weren't for you." Claire smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "You'd have done the same for me," she said. "You already did, all those years ago." James chuckled, a sound that felt lighter than it had in weeks. "Guess we're even now," he said. Claire shook her head. "Not even," she said. "Just family." The words hung in the air, simple but profound, and for the first time in years, Claire felt truly at peace.